This is going to be a really fun exercise. I got the idea for what we're going to walk through in this guide and also in the next one from a student who's looking to add this to their application. And so what we're going to build out is a character countdown. So if you've ever seen tools such as Twitter and you saw how you were typing something into a form input and it was counting down on the screen, that is what we're going to build out. And in the next guide, we're going to extend it and see how we can build out the ability to have multiple character countdowns on the same page and to follow best practices while doing it. So all of the HTML we're going to need is already on the page here. I have a input that has a class of message input, and then we have this div that has our countdown, and I've wrapped up our message counter inside of a span. So with all of that in place, we can start writing our code. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set our variables. So I'm going to say const message input. And so I'm going to use a query selector. So I'll say document.query selector, and we just want a regular query selector, not all here. And then we'll pass in the value that we're looking for, which in this case is the message input. And with that in place, we can also come and grab our message counter because we're going to need this in order to set its value. So I'll go message counter and then counter, just like this. Now, the last variable we're going to need is a max value. So this is going to be the max character count. So for this case, it's going to be 144. So I'll say const max, and by default, we'll just have it set to 144 at the beginning. So everything there is all the data that we're going to need. Now, when we have something that is a little bit more on the non-trivial side, so we're not just trying to add a class or do anything like that. We actually have to maintain a level of state here because we're not just looking to toggle something, we're looking to keep track of something. So whenever we're going to do that, I think it definitely pays off to think our way through the process that we're going to want to follow. A couple things that I think we are going to need is I'm going to need a way of ensuring that we have not hit the max value. So ensure character count. So we're going to create a function just for that. And then I'm going to need an event listener that will watch for the key up. So if you think about events in JavaScript, what happens when the user is typing? You have a few different events whenever you're working with an input field. So one of them is key down. That's where someone presses the key and it goes down. But what we actually want is we want to know when the key is up because that's when they have finished typing. So if I type S here, the key up event will trigger as soon as my finger comes off of the keyboard. So that is all we're looking for here, and we need to keep track of it. And so we're going to have an event listener that's going to do that. And then we're going to, as the user is typing, we're going to ensure that they have not gone past the character count. So let's create this character count function first. So I'm going to say const, and then let's call this ensure content length. You can call it whatever you like, but I think that is a good name for that. And this is going to take in two arguments. It's going to take in the content, and it's going to take in whatever the max value is. And I'll use an arrow function here. And so inside of this, I'm just going to have a basic conditional. So I'll say if content dot length is greater than our max, then I want to return false, and else I want to return true. So that part is pretty basic. All we're doing is we're saying I need a content and a max, and if the content length is greater than max, then I want you to return false, which means that we're no longer ensuring this character count. So that is our validator. So now with that in place, let's come down here and add our event listener. Now we're going to take a different approach than we've taken before, and it's because we need to actually keep track of the length. If I were to do something like this, where I say message input dot add event listener, and then I listen for on key up, this actually would not work in this example because we need to keep track of the total length. We don't just want to know about the event. That's where this is very different than, say, a click. We actually want to know and keep track of everything. So I'm going to say message input dot on key up, and then set this equal to a function declaration. Now, do not use an arrow function here, and I'll show you why in a minute. So just use a regular function declaration. And now what we're going to do is we're going to grab that counter, which is actually message counter. So message counter, and then we'll say message counter dot inner HTML, because we're wanting to set this value right here. So I'm going to say inner HTML equals our max, and then minus this dot value dot length. So let's save this and see if this is working. So come over here, hit refresh, and now if I type in one character, it counted down. Perfect. Type another one, and this is working perfectly. Now, if you're wondering why you needed to use function right here, let's take a look at that before we finish this exercise. So if I tried to go with an arrow expression and said something like that, watch what happens if I try to console log this. So if I say console log and this dot value and hit save, if I come back and hit refresh, let's see what this actually is. So it is undefined, and we have an error. It says uncaught type error, cannot read property length of undefined. So what this means is, because we used an arrow function, what this means is this changed the scoping of what this represents. And so remember that the arrow function is not just a shorter way of writing a function. It specifically is going to change how this is scoped. And so in this case, we actually want to go with the traditional just function declaration in order to have the proper scope of this defined. And so if I change that back, hit refresh, now this is working perfectly, and you can see it keeps track of the value. It doesn't just give us the event. And so this is why I didn't just want the event value. I wanted to use this full expression, just because I think it makes sense to structure it this way, and you have access to all the data that you are looking for. Now, let me clear this console log out, because we have one more feature that I think would be pretty cool to add in. And that is, I want to keep track, because you may notice we haven't actually even used this function yet. And it's because I want to keep track of the character counts, and then I want to disable this if it goes over the limit. So if this goes up to 144, I want to disable the field so the user can't even type anything else in. So I'm going to come back into our event listener here and say if, and then say I'm going to start off with the with a bang, and then say ensure content length. And remember, this takes in 2 arguments. So this is going to take in this dot value, and then it's going to take in the max minus 1. And the reason for that is because if you don't do max minus 1, remember that the values and everything, you're going to end up in a situation where you have an off by 1 error. And so I'm going to subtract 1 from it, and then inside of here say message input dot disabled equals true. So if all of this works, let's change our max down here to something like 20. And so if all this is working, as soon as I hit 20 characters, then it should go and it should disable this field. So I'm going to hit refresh. And don't let the 144 scare you away. That's just simply hard-coded in. It'll change as soon as I start typing. So I type in one character, it's 19. Another one, 18. And so if I keep going, as soon as we hit 0, look at that. The field is now disabled and I can't type anything else in. And so that is because this cool little ensure content length function here was checking for the value. It was watching it at each key up event. And then as soon as we hit that max, it simply said, okay, it's time to disable this entire field. So this is a really fun introduction to learning how to work with text inputs, how to have some more insight into the differences between arrow functions and traditional function declarations, and how we could build a cool character countdown feature.